Thank you. Okay, everyone, good morning, and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about how Windows 10 is going to disrupt the revolution of cyber threats with some pretty revolutionary security. My name is Chris Hallam. I'm Senior Product Manager for Windows Client Security, so anything that's in the Windows Client OS to defend it against external threats, that falls in my wheelhouse. Of course, security is fairly complex and involves server components and other infrastructure on the server side. I'm really focused on the client side. Of course, that's a pretty broad space. So at any rate, we are going to speed date through 68 slides. So this is a big deck. Some of these slides take a couple seconds, some take a little longer, but there's a lot of content I want to present to you. So we're going to move very quickly, and I think it'll still be fun, even though I think we'll feel like we're in a bit of a hurry. But there's some great points we want to land with you, and so we want to make sure you get as much as you can. So with that, let's kind of talk about how Microsoft views the threat landscape very quickly. Our view is most of you and your organizations have deployed the best solutions, at least that you can afford. Maybe they're not the best in the industry, but you've done what you could with the resources you have. But the challenge is the threat landscape has changed pretty dramatically. And it may not really matter what you've deployed. Even if you've got FireEye and 50 other security solutions in your environment, it's very likely that you still have network intruders, malware threats, and these types of things. So even the best defenses really don't provide you the defense that you actually need in the modern landscape. And the reason why, of course, is we're dealing with a literal revolution of cyber threats. We're not dealing with incremental threats that are a little bit more sophisticated than last year or a little more aggressive. We're actually seeing us move up the hockey stick, and we're seeing things become kind of almost dangerous, and you'll see in a minute how that's true. And so if we look at the evolution of attacks, we all remember 2003 and 4, right? This is the XP era, and XP wasn't designed to deal with the threats that we didn't know were coming. We were surprised in this moment, maybe not everybody, but I think the operating system was surely surprised, and surely you were. But the motives back then were really mischief and fame, and it was pretty interesting. They actually just tried to take down networks, and they just tried to see if they could do it, and they were fairly successful, as you know. And then we released XP SP2, and we were able to mitigate a lot of those threats and kind of put a tourniquet on the bleeding there. But then what happened is the cybercrime organizations got pretty sophisticated. So about 2005, and this will continue on and on for as far as we can see. Organized crime is monetizing this very successfully, right? So we all know about CryptoLocker, and we know about click fraud, and we know what happened to Target and Home Depot and Neiman Marcus, and I hate to call names out, but there's nothing to be embarrassed about. I mean, like I said earlier, the defenses we have in place are just not capable of dealing with the attacks that we have. So, but now we've moved into a different space, and this is that hockey stick moving up very quickly. And so about 2012, and we can debate what that date is roughly, but we saw nation states get heavily engaged in this. And so the motives of it have changed a bit. More recently, we've seen damage and disruption coming back, right? So it's almost a return back to 2003. We see, exfiltration and IP theft being, one of the main things they're doing. And you'll find that these attacks are brazen and more complex and persistent and all these different things. But the attackers we're dealing with now are not just attacking, or the nation states in particular, aren't just attacking other nations. They're attacking private organizations like your own. So it's a very different place that we're in, and so we really need to move to a different place from a platform perspective to give you the defenses. So let's very quickly overview a very common attack. It's an example of kind of an identity attack and malware kind of all being used in concert, and maybe some of you are familiar with this type of attack. But this is very similar to what most of you have probably experienced. So we always start with a healthy computer, and more recently we see phishing attacks being very successful during users websites. So of course, once a user is lured to that site, they may be asked to download something. So maybe if you saw the keynote, Brad downloaded something. He thought that came from a friend of his, and he installed a new expense app that actually turned out to be malware. Or maybe it's maybe the site's using a 0-day, or maybe the plugin you have in the browser, maybe Flash or Java, is not up to date. So it's not a 0-day, it's actually an old vulnerability that just keeps on getting exploited because the user hasn't patched their system up correctly. But at any rate, somehow an infection gets on the PC, and what we're finding is some of these infections don't actually inflict the damage or activate themselves right away. They may actually lie dormant for some period of time, and then something will happen, right? And what we've seen in one particular attack is this thing that happens is just a performance problem for the end user. So what the attacker is trying to do is trying to not take data off this user's PC necessarily. What they're trying to do is they're trying to bootstrap the ability to move laterally across the network. And so what they do is they cause a performance problem on the PC that's going to generate a help desk call. So the user calls help desk, and then help desk remotes into their PC, and then the malware steals that user's credential, the help desk user, and now I've got a much more interesting user than I started with, potentially. Now, if my attack started on an IT professional's PC, maybe that's all I needed, and I can move laterally from there. But if I got maybe an administrative assistant with very limited access to my network, I need to get that help desk user in there to get a more interesting user, and then from there I can maybe go to another user, and then I can spread out across the network. So there's a million variations of this attack, but the point I want to make here is that a simple phishing attack going after the most insignificant person in your organization may actually be the perfect way to start an attack that leads all the way to domain admin credentials. And we've seen cases where an attack within 2 hours can take network control and domain admin control using an example like this. So with that, what we need to do in Windows 10 is we need to make some serious steps forward, right, to address this. And so what we do is we take a very systematic approach to dealing with this in 10, and we had some of this even in the past. But what we really need to do, and this is something one of our teams thinks about very carefully, is like we want to just systematically break the economics of the attacks. Now, when it comes to a nation state, I can't break the economics. They have unlimited budgets to go after people, in theory, right? But the crime orgs, the crypto locker people, I bet we can put enough defenses in place to make it really, really hard for them to go after you in the future, right? So if we can break the economics, we can maybe, if we think of a pyramid of attackers getting more and more sophisticated, the least sophisticated on the bottom, I might be able to slice that in half or maybe even better than that, just by making it really expensive for them. The next thing we need to do is break the playbook that they have. And the good news is we have a ton of telemetry data coming in. We have hundreds of millions of PCs giving us information. We have information sharing with McAfee and Symantec. And so there's this huge pool of information that we can gather and analyze. And we actually know how these attacks work. I showed you one example, and there's a million other types like it. But we know what the attacks look like. In fact, when we looked in in Windows 8, and we said, hey, how are we going to deal with vulnerabilities? We identified 24 unique vulnerability exploit paths, meaning there's this path that they could take with this type of vulnerability, and this is how they would succeed in getting into the system. We broke all 24 in Windows 8. Now, more have been found, but we keep on making it more expensive, and hopefully there'll be fewer opportunities moving forward. But when you know the playbook and you systematically break it, you can have great results, as you'll see here later in the presentation. And then something we're doing in 10 that I think is a little bit different, something we always wanted to do, but we couldn't take the time to do it, was we need to change the architecture of the system so we have fundamental immunities against some of these attacks. These vulnerabilities, even though they've come up with new ways to exploit them, at the end of the day, what they're actually doing is the exploit path to success may be different, but the weakness in the system that they're exploiting is kind of the same, right? Some of these weaknesses have been around for 10, 20 years. We've just never been able to eradicate them. We put more defenses on top to make it harder to exploit the vulnerability, but we've never eliminated the actual problem in the operating system. So with Windows 10, we've taken the time to deliver some technologies that remove some of the fundamental weaknesses that we've had in desktop platforms, and in some respects had already eliminated on Windows Phone. Right? If you're familiar with Windows Phone and the security architecture there, a lot of the ideas there are moving into the desktop platform. So with that said, I just want to give you a quick overview of where we're at in 7 versus where we're going to be in 10, and then we're going to show you some of these technologies we're going to talk about them. So in the world you're in 7, and I'm kind of speaking kind of generally, this may not be your case, but in the Windows 7 world, typically we're using passwords or very, very limited use of two-factor authentication. With Windows 10, the technology, Microsoft Passport, which we'll talk about in a little bit, there's no excuse for people not to be running two-factor authentication everywhere on their network, on every resource, for login, even on the most insignificant assets. I'm almost yet to meet somebody who actually has two-factor everywhere in their organization. It's usually the VPN, maybe some other assets on the network, but very rarely across everything. So we want to make it easy. When it comes to data protection, you're used to provisioning encryption solutions like BitLock or McAfee. You spend a bunch of time doing that work. The world of Windows 10 is a world where PCs will increasingly be already encrypted when you receive them. Now, you can opt out of that, and you can put your own encryption solution like McAfee or Symantec, Sophos, or we can name many others. But if you want, by default, BitLock can be turned on automatically. So the act of provisioning and managing encryption is something we want to go away. That should just be a default configuration. You're used to looking at third parties for DLP. You're deploying it regularly on mobile, not regularly on the desktop. Very, very few people are using DLP solutions on the desktop because they're cumbersome and they get in the way, and there's just too much friction. So we have a solution in 10 that allow you to move into the DLP world just out of the box in a very simple way. When it comes to threats, you're used to PCs that can get infected with malware, right? And there's lots of great defenses, but at the end of the day, I can't name a single person who hasn't experienced malware in their organization. With technology we'll talk about called Device Guard and things we're doing in Windows Defender, I think we're going to really, I hate to use the cliche, use game change, which we all know how big a cliche that is. Guard is a game changer for real, and you'll see why here in a minute. And then finally, when it comes to the devices, you use devices that don't use hardware-rooted trust, meaning everything's being done in software, all the security is being done there. Windows 10 and the things we need to achieve requires hardware to fully be able to give you the full benefits of the platform. So that gives you a quick overview of where you're on 7, where you're on 10. So I'm hoping you already feel there's quite a distance from where you're at now and where you'll be when you move to 10. So when we organize our effort at Microsoft, we kind of organize it around these pillars, and we'll drill down on each one, and we'll start with secure devices. So when it comes to the type of hardware that we need to address some of these problems, the first thing we need to make sure the device can have integrity. Right? If you can put a bootkit under Windows, then it's game over. Right? Windows maybe is completely owned and doesn't even realize there's something under it, taking control of system memory and all the resources. So we need the ability to make sure that there's integrity from the firmware level and the hardware all the way to the point where we start Windows. We need to make sure that happens. And UEFI Secure Boot, which is a Windows 8 feature, that's our solution there. We need cryptographic processing, meaning we need TPM. 2015 is the year where TPM goes mainstream on every PC. Every Windows PC should have TPM now. And if you're worried about China and Russia, I'm not an attorney, so you need to work with your own legal counsel. But the restrictions that people believe are in place, they're probably very different than what you think they are. So we have good news in China and Russia, but I want to refer you to your own legal counsel to make sure that you're doing the right things for your organization. But the idea that it's completely restricted is actually no longer the case. But you may need special permission. You may need to do a number of things. So go through the right process so that you can use that. Biometrics. Biometrics has been something that we've had on Windows for a long time, but it's never gone mainstream. And the reason why is a number of things. We didn't have the middleware necessary to drive the enrollment process and the credential process. We really just had a framework that Lenovo could build on top of so that their fingerprint sensors could work. We have everything you need in the box. The only thing we don't have is the driver for the sensor, and that's easy for us to get through the OEM. So Windows is ready for biometrics, and the pipeline for biometrics-enabled devices is looking pretty rich. And so you'll see a lot of disclosures late in the year on that. The last thing, I think everything above that we've talked about so far is really kind of from Windows 8. I think the thing that's new is that biometric sensors are going to start to mainstream, but we've had a lot of that functionality before. What is new in Windows, and this is central to our strategy to deal with malware and these types of things, is we need virtualization extensions in the processor. We need Hyper-V, believe it or not, on the client to be able to defend and protect certain Windows processes away from a kernel that we have to assume will be compromised. Right? Just like you assume breach in your network, we have to assume breach of the kernel. And if we have that mentality, that means that certain things in Windows shouldn't be in the Windows operating system anymore. They need to move somewhere else. And let's go ahead and drill down on that technology. So something that Jim Alcove and a number of others have talked about this week is really one of the most powerful architectural changes to the Windows platform. We call it Virtual Secure Mode, or VSM. What VSM is a basically, we take advantage of the hypervisor on the PC, and we boot a mini operating system, and we put sensitive Windows processes into that component, that VSM, which is really just a VM, and we separate those from Windows. So what we're trying to achieve here, trying to prevent the case where the kernel is compromised, that the malware that's running on that PC or the user has control of what's going on in memory or a bit of both. We want to make sure they don't have the ability to tamper with some of these sensitive processes. So if we go to the next slide here, you'll see kind of how the architecture works. So on the right-hand side, you'll see kind of what you're familiar with, right? We've got hardware, we've got Windows with a kernel and apps running on top of it. And of course, there's a lot more detail in there that we could draw, but I wanted to keep it simple. What we have running in parallel is the hypervisor running the VSM, which has its own kernel, and it has what we call trustlets running inside it. One of the trustlets is going to be the local security authority. So if you've ever heard of pass a hash, by moving the hashes, by moving the process that brokers authentication out of Windows, we can create the condition where Mimikatz can't get the hashes. So pass the hash is not just defended against, it's architecturally potentially eliminated, at least in its current form. Right? We'll see new variations of the attack, but you can probably see the difference between adding a defense on top of a kernel that could be compromised versus moving the defenses and moving the components out of Windows so that they can run secure and tamper-free. Now, something that's important to know about this VSM has no network, it has no UI, there's no way to touch it. It's just a little black box that runs on its own, and that makes it very secure, right? That means that it can't be tampered with, right? If it has a network connection, then it can be attacked remotely, right? So the way we've designed this is to try to give it the immunity, that to the extent we can give anything immunity, away from all the common attacks that we're familiar with. Another process that we're putting in there is exciting for server folks in the room, that's virtual TPM. So today, we love TPM on clients, but we're frustrated on servers. Well, now we have a virtual TPM component that runs in this secure execution environment. And by the way, we like to call the VSM a secure execution environment. It is, right? It's isolated from the operating system, and we can execute things securely within it. But virtual TPM is going to be great for servers, obviously. And then the last thing is what we call hypervisor code integrity. So if you're familiar with the code integrity service, that's what looks at a binary image and says, hey, this is signed and hasn't been tampered with. Well, if I'm a malware author, the first thing I want to do in Windows is disable code integrity so I can run tampered with bootloaders or whatever. So we need to make sure that component's pulled out of Windows. We need to create the condition also where system memory isn't even managed by the kernel anymore, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So anyway, VSM really is a huge innovation for the platform. It offers a level of security that we've never had before. And for these three scenarios, these are really decisive in their ability to deal with the challenges we've faced in the TPM world, the pass-the-hash world, and also the malware world with code integrity. So that's a big one. So make sure you write that one down. But let's move to a new area. Let's talk about passwords. And we have actually an interesting video that we just got done. Nobody outside of my team has seen this. It's pretty funny. I hope you find it humorous, but it only takes 90 seconds. So let's go ahead and take a quick look.
Passwords. Some of our employees were having a hard time with them. Use both upper and lowercase letters.
Uppercase S, lowercase t, U, P, I, D.
Passwords must be at least 9 characters long. Include at least 1 numerical digit and include special characters.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe the correct term is exceptional characters.
Thanks. Do not use words found in a dictionary. Yeah.
Like B-I-T-E?
Do not use your name or a family member's name.
You're still 1 character short.
And finally, passwords must change every 90 days. Yeah.
What if I forget Julugi, capital S, exclamation point, snoo2?
We were having a lot of problems with passwords, but with iris scan and thumbprint login and devices with enterprise-grade security, even our employees can handle that.
All right, so anyway, that's a funny video. The Microsoft, or the Windows brand team made that video with our assistants. And so anyway, we're pretty excited. There's actually a series of these that we're doing, and I think you'll find those funny. But at any rate, at this point, you already know passwords suck. You knew that probably before you entered in the room, but why are they so bad other than what you learned in the video or already knew? The big challenge is that they're shared or shareable secrets, right? I can share them with you willingly or unwillingly. Maybe a keylogger steals it. So they're just not secure, and they also represent a single factor of authentication. If I can get that, I can be you. And it's also a network secret, meaning if I get this, I can be you anywhere in the world potentially. So passwords are just not okay. They're symmetrical secrets, and they're just broken from an authentication perspective. And so we need to move away from them. Here's a couple slides just on how easy it is to get them. One stat that's interesting is, turns out that 75% of users try to the extent that they can, to use the same password everywhere. So if somebody wants to break into your bank, they don't have to hit the bank or brute force their way in there. They'll just hit a little tiny mom and pop website that you bought batteries from. And they'll breach that, and now they have the password that probably you use, at least on a few other sites. So that's kind of how they managed to get passwords. And there was one group who managed to get 1.2 billion username and password combinations. They assembled those by breaching these little obscure websites and putting them all together. So if you think about that in terms of how many people are online, there's about 2 billion people online. 1.2 billion passwords, chances are some of our passwords are actually sitting in their hands. So that's a problem. Something that people don't maybe know is they think that their passwords on the network or their domain passwords are secure. Phishing is pretty easy to do. Google did some research on this, and they found that depending how you looked on the data, anywhere from 45% of users all the way down to, I think it was mid-single digits, let's call it 5 or 4%, were successfully phished when they were lured to a website. So that means your domain user accounts can be stolen that way. That's based on some research Google did with their own Gmail accounts and whatnot. But here's something people frequently don't realize is that if your machine is not encrypted, the LSA store that has all the secrets, right? If you get if you get physical access to the PC and you get access to the disk, I can get your username and password without even logging in. I can just go into the file system, run a tool against the right file, and I can get this data. So if you're not encrypting devices, even servers, right, you're vulnerable to this threat. So you need to make sure you're encrypting these volumes, whether they're desktops or mobile or servers, because your username and passwords are exposed. I mean, imagine logging into a server and discarding that disk inappropriately. If that's from a DC, that's your domain admin's account that could be acquired. So you need to be really careful. You need to be thinking about provisioning encryption holistically across your network. Now, some of you have addressed the password threat through PKI, and you probably feel like you got over a big mountain, right? PKI is really hard, and it's really difficult and expensive and challenging. But you got two-factor now, so you're feeling really good. But I'm almost yet to meet anybody, and I've met a few, incidentally, but most people don't deploy two-factor authentication holistically across their network because it's too expensive and too challenging. It requires cards and dongles and all sorts of things. And if you get a mobile device like a Surface 3 or some of these tablets, I can't plug in a smart card reader into that very easily, or at least I wouldn't want to. So what happens is people only deploy their PKI infrastructure solutions like two-factor on the VPN. Actually, I kind of got ahead of myself here. They only deploy it on the VPN or on the high-value assets, and then they leave everything else exposed to username and passwords. And I hate to admit but you know what? Microsoft's still using passwords. Now with Passport, which we're going to talk about in a second, we're going to be able to move there very quickly and move away from passwords. But even we face the same challenges you do, so don't feel bad if you're only protecting the VPN. So what we need to deal with this is we need to simplify the implementation of the infrastructure, and we need to reduce the cost. And we also need to reduce the friction on users. And with a new solution that we have called Microsoft Passport, that is exactly what we're going to do. So what is Passport? Passport, if you're familiar with a smart card or virtual smart card, pretty much the same thing. But the problem with smart cards is it was limited, right? A smart card must use a PIN to unlock it, and biometrics, that's the way we want to go, right? So fundamentally, I can't do that with a smart card. It's not allowed. The other thing is the keys that I use for authentication have to come from PKI infrastructure. And not all organizations have PKI infrastructure they're using for user authentication, right? They may use it for certain scenarios, but not that. And if you're a mid-market or SMB, there's no way that most of you will be able to use PKI infrastructure. So there's no option for them except for options that are kind of kludgy compared to what the high-end enterprises are using. So with Microsoft Passport, we take all the best attributes of a smart card. So we're talking about either a certificate-based solution. So we got a public-private key, and we're using asymmetrical-based auth. And we can use a PIN if we want to use a PIN, but then we're expanding its capability to do two things that smart cards can't, which is I can use biometrics with it, and I can also use what we call key-based auth. So the challenge with PKI is the keys have to come to me from some central authority, right? Well, Microsoft Passport has the technology to generate its own keys. And we have hardware with TPMs and all this great technology that we have now in the hardware level. I can generate unique in the world key pairs that in theory could never be reproduced, and I can do that here locally. So why do I need to provision an identity centrally when I can create an identity that I could use, a unique key pair, and I can use that for auth, and I can do that locally without any sort of overhead on the top end. So the next thing that makes Passport interesting is we can, instead of using a physical card that requires a reader, like a smart card, we can turn the devices that you're already using into one of the factors. So my Surface 3 can be one of the factors, or I got my HP Envy here that we're going to demo here in a minute. That can be one of the factors. And then the other factor, of course, could be my PIN or my biometric identity. So this gives us a lot of options. Now, another thing I can do is I can put my identity on my mobile device. So imagine bringing this phone here with my credential. I enroll this, and I get my new asymmetrical key pair. I got my public-private key here, and I bring that in proximity of one of these devices, and using Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, I can sign in with my PIN here and access the credential that's here, right? So this is kind of like a smart card, but it's wireless. Fundamentally, under the hood, it is a smart card, right? Because it's maybe a cert, or maybe it's a key-based authentication option like we talked about. So this is cool. Now, there's another option. Some organizations like, hey, we can't depend on our users to have mobile phones. Maybe we want to give them a card like an NFC type of thing. Now, we are not designing in the box for that solution, but we have an SDK that enables ISVs to build that, or IHVs in this case. So we're already talking to one company that is considering doing an NFC device for that. So it doesn't have to be a phone or a PC that's one of your factors. It could be something else. And the SDK broadens it to any sort of device you can imagine. And of course, the credential itself can be secured by hardware. So this key pair or this certificate that we provision down to the PC, if it can be extracted, then I can replay your identity from another device. So what we do is we make sure that we use the TPM, if it's present, to physically bind, to the extent that we can physically bind anything with software and hardware. But it's basically bound to the PC. So the TPM encrypts that data. So if you're able to pull the data off the disk, you wouldn't be able to replay it. So if you get disk access and steal the file, all you're getting is encrypted data that of course can't be replayed. So Passport, very similar to a smart card, but much better, more flexible. I can use biometrics. I don't have to use PKI if I don't want to, etc. And so this slide here kind of explains how this new approach will work. So I talked about key-based auth, where the keys are generated locally. So let's quickly kind of talk how that will work. So the first thing that you'll need to do is you'll need to prove who you are, right? So I need to prove that I'm me, or I need to create a new account to kind of bootstrap the process. So imagine signing into your brand new PC, and let's imagine that we're signing into Azure with a brand new PC. So with that, you can sign in with your Azure account. You're going to type in your password because that's the only proofing mechanism you have today. But then once you've done that, you would receive a one-time code from Azure. So you receive this code on the phone. You type that in. Now you've got something physical where you've received something. So AD in this, or Azure AD is going to say, hey, I trust if this person has this code and their password that it must be them. So then what that happens from there is Windows, using Passport technology, generates a unique key pair, or it could receive the private key from your infrastructure. But a key is generated. It's then shared up to the Active Directory service. I'm sharing my public key in the key-based mode. I map that to the Azure AD account. And then everything else works just the way authentication has always worked. So the only thing that's different here is my keys are getting generated locally, and instead of getting my public key from my infrastructure, the device is sending the public key to AD or Azure AD and then mapping that to my account. So it's very familiar. It doesn't require a big infrastructure change to make this go. And it's, I think key-based auth actually gives us a security advantage, because at the end of the day, CAs are getting compromised. And if I can compromise your CA, I can steal all your identities on the network. With this, the private keys only exist on the devices, on the endpoints. So there's two ways to access your PIN or your passport. One is through PIN, and the PIN can be alphanumeric, can be complex, and there's all sorts of rules that you can use around that. But of course, Windows Hello is the best way to take advantage of your passport. Windows Hello is a biometric means to unlock your device and unlock the container that secures your passports, plural. So your device could have many, many passports. I could have one for AD, I could have one for my Microsoft account, I could have one for third-party services on the internet. So I could have a bunch of these passports sitting in a container, and Windows Hello, when I sign into my device, unlocks the container. So think of Hello as just really an unlock mechanism to the device and the system and the containers for all your passports. Once you've done that, those passports can be used for auth when you're challenged by a website to prove your identity. So Windows Hello is pretty cool. We'll show you a demo quick minute here. But what we try to do is make it kind of engaging with the user. So is the sensor is attempting to detect who they are, either with facial or iris. You'll see this animation, so you know, okay, the sensor's looking at me, and we're going through this authentication process. You'll see that here in a second. And then we can use fingerprints, iris, and facial. So all the middleware you need for everything, the only thing we need is a driver from the sensor manufacturer. Everything you need is in the box. So that's unlike Windows 7, where you got your brand new Lenovo with a fingerprint sensor and you had to download some Lenovo bits to do authentication. And a lot of people are like, hey, I don't think Lenovo's a company I want to entrust with my identity infrastructure on my network. So most people didn't use those sensors as a result. But now that we have all the full stack in Windows, right, and hopefully you trust our security, we believe that people will have a lot of faith in fingerprints and iris and facial. And then our biometric framework opens up the opportunity for other things like palm readers and all the other options out there. But Windows Hello is actually limited to these three at this point. So let's do a quick demo. Let me see, I need to switch to 8. So I've got an actual in-market device here. This is the HP Envy. There's a Dell device out there as well. I forget the name. Lenovo has one. And those 3 devices, and I think there's more, have technology from Intel called RealSense. Now, RealSense cameras have been positioned as a 3D gesture connect-like thing so far, but it has an infrared camera, and the infrared camera allows us to do some really interesting authentication that is less spoofable, and I say less spoofable because we never promise that something is unspoofable. That would be a bad thing to say, but it gives us this resistance that I think will meet the enterprise-grade requirements that many of you would have. So what I've done is I've hid the cameras, because what happens, this can happen so quickly when it's working right that I would already be signed in. But you can see it's looking for me, and hopefully as soon as I remove this, it signs me right in. And it's a great experience. So imagine just sitting down to your PC, and boom, it logs you in. Now, there is an option. Some people say, you know what, I don't think I want my screen to unlock. What if somebody's in my office and I just glance at my computer and I don't want it to expose some information on the desktop? We have a setting here which allows you to say, hey, authenticate me, but don't lift the lock screen until I flip it. So there's 2 different options. One just automatically unlock it. The other one is authenticate, but unlock with the flip of the finger or the enter key or whatever key you want to do that. So we have that in mind. And then we have another way of even increasing the security of facial recognition, which is what we're using here. When we do facial recognition like I just did, it's just looking at my face head on here. But if I turn my head, I'm giving the sensor more information to look at, and that makes it spoofing a lot more difficult. So if I were to do that setting, what would happen is I would look left and right, maybe up and down, and then it would get a more broader view of my face, and then it would sign me in then. So there's 2 ways. We believe that this way I just showed you, just looking head on, that's a pretty secure way, but those with higher levels of sensitivity might opt in for this additional setting. Now, one demo that I'd like to show before we move on back to the deck is a demo that's pretty challenging because this software doesn't always work, but guess what? It is this time. This is great. Okay. And what I'm going to show you is what we're looking at. So as I mentioned, we're not using an RGB camera. We're using an infrared camera. And so you can see here, we're looking at a different spectrum of light, so we're not looking at color. And the beauty here is, if I was using an RGB camera, which some biometrics companies use, if I have a high fidelity image, which is this one, although maybe this isn't a high fidelity screen, but here's a picture of myself that I took. You could just replay that in front of the sensor or print it out on some high resolution printer, and you could spoof the sensor. So with IR, I got a picture here. It's obviously colored. You'll see that it doesn't see it, right? So, and if I had paper and printed out, it would look all white or it would look all black, etc. So with IR, it's not going to be spoofable with images that you print out that are color and these types of things. So this just gives you an idea of kind of what's under the hood there. So with that, let's go back to our deck. So like, would it not be able to recognize me because somebody's sitting near me? Or
you're logged in, somebody else sits at your computer. Is it going to log in a separate profile and keep you logged in? Does it say your computer's locked so the person can't get in? What does it do there?
Yeah, so the question is, if I log in and somebody sits at my seat, maybe I'm still present, would it log me out and maybe bring me into a new user profile? The answer would be no. So if you returned back to the lock screen and then the user got in front of it, then it would actually try to access a new profile. But if they're in, then they're going to be you until you lock it. All right, so let me grab the clicker here. All right, so this technology, to promote adoption, there's a couple things we need to make sure happens. We need to make sure that this can work on Windows 7 devices and greater. If you have a TPM in that Windows 7 device, you'll have a higher level of security because that TPM will protect the data, the passport. If you don't have a TPM, we're still going to support it, But in theory, not in theory, in practice, malware could get access to that passport credential, so they could get your private key. I still think it's better than a password, right? But there are some threats you want to think about. So you should really be optimizing your PC purchases on TPM. But it's already pervasive in the enterprise anyway, so I don't even think you really have to think about it. But just be aware of that. That's maybe a more interesting point for BYOD devices. The next thing is we're going to support this technology on AD, Azure AD, and Microsoft accounts right away. So you're going to be able to move away from passwords basically instantly. AAD already will do it for you, and you don't have to think about anything because it's all done in the cloud for you. Microsoft accounts, same thing. We just change our own infrastructure. For AD, you don't have to do any changes to your AD infrastructure if you want to use the PKI-based option. So if you want to deploy certs that you manage the device, you want to build Passport around cert-based auth, which is still asymmetrical, but if you want to use that, you don't need to make any changes. If you want to use key-based auth, where the keys are generated on the PC and sent to the Active Directory, you're going to need to make a change to AD. We're still working on exactly what that change will look like, but that change does not mean that you move to a new version of server. It's a patch or an update that will provision. So imagine being able to update Server 2012, maybe even 2008. I don't know actually where the cut line is, so we'll disclose that later in the product cycle. But you'll be able to update that so you can run Passport with key-based auth. We'll do that in band this summer even. So this sounds like an interesting technology. I hope you guys are excited about it, but you might be thinking, well, what about my world? My world's heterogeneous. I got OS X and iOS, and I've got Android and all these different things. And what happens if Google comes up with another alternative? Well, that's not going to happen. And the reason why is we're actually working with Google. There's a group called the FIDO Alliance, which is a working group working towards eliminating the world of passwords. That's the goal of the group. And so Microsoft's a board member, Google's a board member, here's some other ones. I think there's about 200 plus members of the FIDO Alliance. It's getting a lot of press and it's getting a lot of traction. You can already buy FIDO compliant devices from Yubico and others. Those are already in the marketplace. Microsoft Passport is a contribution to the FIDO 2.0 specification process. So that's a spec that's not been ratified yet. So we've built our design, we've submitted it to the working group, and Google and Microsoft and a number of these people are working together to tune it and tweak it to make it something that's going to work well for the Alliance all up. And so anyway, so we're excited to work in that group and see it ratified. And that could happen this year, maybe next. But our goal is FIDO compliance with the solution, and because that's going to succeed, right? If we had different groups working on different solutions, we'd never solve passwords. Maybe we'd do it on Microsoft networks, but we wouldn't do it on the web. This is going to transform the web, which is important. So let's talk about another threat that we're worried about. And let me do a quick time check. Okay. So let's talk about pass-the-hash real quick. And so pass-the-hash, I think most of you have heard about this, but let me just kind of quickly talk about what pass-the-hash is. So what we talked about so far is user credentials, right? So I've got a token, this Microsoft Passport or a virtual smart card, or I'm still using passwords. That's the user credential that I use for authentication. After AD authenticates me, it gives me something else. And that thing is what we call a derived credential. Derived credentials are like Kerberos tickets or NTLM hashes. And when I have possession of these, as I go to other assets on my network, those assets don't ask me to re-authenticate, right? So it's what gives me single sign-on. So if I have a derived credential that's still valid, I can go walk around the network and not have to constantly sign in again and again and again. So it's what gives us SSO. But as we talked about at that malware attack example at the beginning, people are trying to steal these derived credentials. Because if I can steal your derived credential, I can be you without knowing your name, without knowing your password or anything about you. I don't need your smart card even. It's a total bypass for the authenticator that the users actually use. So if I can get a derived credential, I can be you with all of your access. And so what typically happens is malware will end up on the PC and they'll extract one of these derived credentials. Then from there, the attacker will then start attempting to hit other devices on the network. And eventually, they'll find another device that user has access to. The hope is eventually they will find a device that user has admin privilege on. Right? So I go from one device, I find a bunch of devices out there, 10, and I find one that user I started with, they have admin privilege on that PC. And then what's sitting there? The derived credentials from everybody who's ever logged on that PC, at least that are current, because they do kind of time out and they go away. But I've now got maybe 2, or maybe I got 4, or maybe I got 5, and maybe got 10. And so then from there, I can start getting more and more of these. And so what happens is when I start with one drive credential, I can go to 2 or 4 or 8, and then maybe I can get a whole bunch of these things. And as these things age out and go away, because they do have to be refreshed, I can move to a newer token and then maybe even go back to the original one. And so that's what pass the hash is all about. It's about stealing derived credentials, getting more, and moving laterally across the network, very likely in an undetected way. This is the attack that's being coupled with almost every APT. If I'm a bad actor, why wouldn't I use pass the hash? If I can get admin control, I can do this, and I can start stealing identities pretty readily. So this is affecting many, many organizations. I would argue that probably every famous attack we've heard recently, probably pass the hash was probably part of it, because why wouldn't you use that if it's an option? It's one of the best tools they have in the toolbook. So the solution we have to this brings us back to where we started with this new virtualization technology. What we're going to do is we're going to use the VSM to host the LSA service. And so the LSA service is the authentication broker that manages authentication, and it also has access to all these NTLM hashes, Kerberos tickets, the TGT, and all these other things. So by moving the LSA service and converting into what we call a trustlet, which are the process type that run inside the VSM, I separate the kernel, which we think could get compromised, away from the VSM and this sensitive process and these hashes. And now, even if I own the kernel and I have the highest level of privilege possible, because the tickets and the hashes and the TGT and the NTLM hash are all sitting in this isolated container, I can't get them. I can't pull them out of the container because Windows doesn't have access to that service, and it doesn't have access to those secrets. So this is, effectively the end of pass the hash as it's currently being used. Now, some of you who are kind of savvy on this are probably thinking, well, something has to come out of the VSM in order for Windows to then perform the single sign-on operation. And you're right. But we don't let the hash out. We actually take the hash, we convert it into a new form that the protocol allows, that creates a condition where the hash can't be replayed on other PCs. So it's effectively kind of bound to the device itself. And the same is true with Kerberos. So yes, something has to come out because I have to authenticate from the Windows install that I'm actually using. The VSMs is running as this black box, but what comes out is not replayable. And that's what makes it a game changer, and that's why pass the hash, as it's currently being done, is over. The only thing you could do in theory is to take that thing that comes out and find a way to convert it back to its original form, and we've done a lot of work to make that not possible. So let's move to another area. Let's talk about data protection. So we've done some great things since Windows 7 on this front, and what I like to say is we're kind of completing the stack, right? We've always had a patchwork of data protection things, and now I think we're going to have something that's pretty rich and robust, and we're going to democratize data loss prevention, which is something a lot of you have aspired to but never been able to do, at least on the PCs. So all of you probably know how important it is to protect the data, so I'm not going to go into great detail here, but here's just some interesting stats about how frequently even responsible people like senior managers share content in a way that IT would absolutely cringe by. And I would suspect even IT probably does the same thing, right? They probably break their own rules. But the point is that there's data leaking outside of your organization. Sometimes it's malicious. Oftentimes it's just people trying to get their job done. When things get in our way, we'll use any bypass we can to get our job done. So the data is leaking, and of course, when data does leak and is stolen, of course, the cost to an organization could be huge. So when we think about protecting information, I like to break it into these 4 categories here. We need to protect data on the device. We need to be able to find a way to corporate data from personal data. We need to be able to prevent it from leaking, and then we need to be able to share content in a protected way. And so we've got solutions and assets across all of these in Windows 10, whereas in Windows 7, I think we really only had a patchwork of things that would be very difficult to put together as an end-to-end solution. So let's talk about device protection first. And so when we talk about device protection, we're talking about data at rest protection, and of course that means we're talking about BitLocker. If your last time that you looked at BitLocker was Windows 7, and you said, hey, you know what, BitLocker's not for us, doesn't have management, it doesn't have single sign-on like McAfee, Sophos, and Symantec has, it's time for you to take another look. Even with Windows 8, 8.1, a lot of those challenges were eliminated. So if somebody says that, hey, you have to use a PIN with BitLocker, that may be true if you have a legacy device, but what you'll find is if you have a modern hardware, we can protect the encryption keys without having the user have to sign in with a PIN in the pre-boot experience. So in other words, we can boot you right up to the Windows sign-in and protect your keys, assuming you've configured the device correctly. So So you don't have to have a PIN. And that's one reason why this device here, the Surface 3, all the Atom processor devices or connected standby devices, BitLocker doesn't allow you to use a PIN on them because they don't need a PIN because we're doing all sorts of things to protect. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But there are two flavors of BitLocker-like encryption. One is called device encryption. This is what's on Windows Phone, and it's actually in every edition of Windows, all the way from Enterprise all the way to the base edition. So everybody has an option for encryption. That automatic encryption, called device encryption, will be provisioned if the device is capable of running that technology. Not all devices are capable. If your device doesn't have TPM, that rules you out. Non-TPM devices, we are not going to encrypt those and ask you to use a USB key to boot your PC. That's just not the experience that we're looking for. But something that we're trying to strive for is a world, as I talked about earlier, where the brand new device that you just bought is automatically encrypted out of the box and you don't have to think about provisioning it. So that's where we're going. And so what you'll find in 2015, large percentage of devices that are being shipped by OEMs will be capable of running device encryption. And I think in 2016, we'll see more. And I don't know the point where we say, hey, every device that's brand new is always capable of running this. But I think the percentage will be pretty high pretty quickly. Now, as I mentioned, device encryption is automatic. That means it's automatically provisioned in our default state. Now, what is BitLocker and how is that different than device encryption? Well, all BitLocker is really the engine that's being used for device encryption. It's the same encryption, actually. What makes it different is the ability to manage the encryption. So with device encryption, you get 128-bit only. That's it. That's how it works. With BitLocker, if you want to do 128-bit, that's fine, or you can do 256. If you want to use a PIN, you can add that or not, depending on what we talk about here in a minute. So you have a lot of flexibility in how you configure it. And in either case, it can be managed. So if you bring a device encryption PC into your network and you're using Microsoft BitLocker administration and monitoring, and you want to manage that, it becomes BitLocker. We convert it to the BitLocker mode. And to be honest, there's really not a conversion. It's really just the second you start becoming managed with device encryption, it effectively becomes BitLocker. So you don't have to decrypt or re-encrypt. So device encryption, just think of it as BitLocker, but automatically provisioned in one state. And then if you bring that into your organization, it kind of becomes BitLocker automatically. So we've done a lot of work to make BitLocker super easy to deploy. One way is what we just talked about. It's automatically provisioned. That makes it easy. And I think that when it comes to reliability, performance, and just security, I think we're on par or better than all the competitors out there. Again, the single sign-on capability that we have with this is there. The caveat I want to mention is that it may require you to configure the device in a specific way. If you're using legacy hardware that doesn't have UEFI, for instance, you may need to lock down the BIOS and prevent booting to USB, as an example, because that would be a vector of a bypass around the encryption. So what you will find is if the device is Windows 8 certified or greater, you're very likely going to have to do very little, if anything, to have the device in a state where you can forego the PIN. If it's a Windows 7 device and it's using BIOS and some other things, you may need to maybe password lock the BIOS and prevent booting to USB, which would be one of the bypasses. If you're familiar with the Princeton attack, that's how you do that. Now, there's a white paper that I wrote on this. It's about 25 pages that says, okay, here's the machine types that require PIN, here's the ones that don't, and all the conditions, and it talks about things so that your CISO and the security people in your organization will get confident about configuring devices without a PIN. So I'd recommend you take a look for that. All you have to do is type BitLocker countermeasures in your favorite search engine, and one of the first hits will be this paper, and then you can read on how you can take BitLocker and start dumping pins off your devices, hopefully right away. All right, so let's move to the next area. So we've got BitLocker. And one thing I forgot to mention, IMBAM is an important part of the puzzle. When Windows 7 shipped, we did not have a management solution. So your keys were only in AD. We shipped a management product for BitLocker called Microsoft BitLocker Administration Monitoring. That is a rich, robust, mature product in the marketplace 3 years later. If you think that management was a weakness in BitLocker in the past, I'm not hearing that feedback anymore from customers. So single sign-on, management, those are two big issues that cause people to go to third-party software. We've conquered both of those issues at this point. So let's talk about data separation. And so that leads us to a great new technology. And let's do a quick video.
Most data leaks, well, they're not really intentional. I manage IT for Relic Cloud's marketing org, which is 450 seats. Like any place around, people just can make mistakes. They try to upload confidential documents onto personal cloud storage.
Mute, right? Yeah, I think so.
What I would like to say is that is the stupidest idea I have ever heard.
Copy and paste business information that's really confidential onto the non-corporate sites. We needed a solution that could tell the difference between the personal documents and those really critical business documents that need to be protected. Because a lot of people around here, they don't think. Microsoft's enterprise data protection. I do sleep a little better, but just a little.
All right, so these videos are great. I've been at Microsoft for 17 years. I'm so happy we're a place where we can do things like this. We've never been that funny before. So these are great. All right, so let's talk about some solutions you have in the market for data separation and protecting content. So on the mobile side, we're familiar with Knox, Good Technologies, AirWatch. There's a bunch of others. They're all using containers or persona switching to protect the data. And the challenge with that is it compromises the user experience. To protect data, in the case of, let's say, AirWatch or Good Technology, I don't get to use Outlook. I got to hop into a new email client that is not as rich as Outlook and may not be the thing I prefer. It's also a different email client than what I'm using on the desktop. So I have two different experiences for email, which is not ideal. So on the mobile side, good security with these solutions, not a great user experience. On the desktop side, we have a better user experience because it's better integrated, because I think the Windows platform is richer from an extensibility perspective, but the costs are high. There is some friction. It's just not ideal, and I find that few people actually deploy the DLP solutions on the desktop side. And so the solutions, in my view, are just not good enough. And so what we need to do, and the only way we can address these issues, is we have to bake the protection into the platform itself. If you're going to protect data and you're on Android or on iOS, how are you going to do that? There's no extensibility there. So the only thing you can do is separate the data from everything else by putting it inside a sandbox and a container and keeping it inside there, right? So containers, at least in terms of like Good Technology, are the only way that they can do it, right? They would love to be better integrated in the platform, but they can't. So it's the only option they have. So with Windows, we have the ability, since we're Microsoft, to extend our platform to have this level of capability in the box. And so enterprise data protection is that solution. So it protects data at rest, but not like BitLocker where the whole volume is encrypted. With EDP, we're protecting everything at the file level. So every single file that's corporate will be protected at the file level, and then as it moves around your organization, that protection remains. Of course, it's seamlessly integrated in the platform, as you'll see here in a minute. So this protection is baked into the platform, meaning I don't need to switch you into a new place or a new folder or into a container to protect the data. Windows is the access control broker and decides what's corporate and what's not, and protects the things that make sense and leaves things that are personal alone. So the platform all handles that seamlessly, meaning that your user experience doesn't change from what you're used to at all. And then it kind of goes on. And so let's talk about the next feature, and then I'll show you a quick demo of this. So we've got data separation. I can protect it at the file level. As that data roams around, my internet, my intranet, it can remain protected. If it ends up on a USB, it can be protected. But what about leaking data? How do we protect against that? Well, in this case here, we have a couple new features. And so we start with the third bullet from the bottom, which is we have a policy that allows you to dictate which apps on the device have access to corporate data. So by default, every app has access to your corporate data, but you may say, hey, you know what? We want to limit it to this app. Let's imagine you have a line of business app that creates its own artifacts, right? You can say only this line of business app that we built ourselves has access to our corporate data. No other apps, for instance, would do that. That's one option. We also have copy-paste protection. So if you're familiar with rights management services, you know that prevented you from copying and pasting content outside of the original document. But I think it was actually too much protection, right? Because it actually prevented me from copying content to another corporate document. Well, with this, what happens is we have copy-paste protection that allows you to create the condition where your data can be copied and pasted in other corporate documents and other new documents, but when those documents are saved in that case, they would be automatically encrypted or protected as corporate. So now there's really no friction, right? I can copy and paste stuff around. It's not about keeping the data inside one document. It's about making sure it stays inside your organization and doesn't leak into personal content. And then, of course, the experience itself is common between all of the platforms. So your EDP is something that's on Windows Phone, it's on it's on Windows 10, and we have a version of it that doesn't have the same level of integration. It's a lot like AirWatch in some respects, or Good, on iOS and Android, right? So because we can't integrate deeply in their platform, we kind of have the same experience that they've had on other phones themselves. So let me do a quick demo. Oops, wrong device. All right, so I'm on my Surface 3 here, and the first thing I want to show you is just what things look like at the file system level. So you'll see here we have a list of files. The ones that are green are the ones that are considered corporate. So there's a new column you'll see, and files that are green mean that they're encrypted, and so there's no reason to put things in special folders, although you can create special folders that when data enters in that folder automatically gets encrypted, but that's an option you can use or not. But basically all data is automatically highlighted as green, and you see this extra tag there. So that means that we're not using partitions or any funky stuff to do that. Now let me show you an example of the copy-paste protection. So this document here is, let me open up. So this green one here, let's open up Memo. So this is a corporate document. So this Word has opened up, and this document, it's in this corporate mode. And so if I want to copy and paste this into a unauthorized app, let's say WordPad, or any app, you'll find when I try to paste it, it blocks me. Now there's two options here. One could be block utterly. There's no choice. I just block it. Or another option is you allow them to paste it, but our UI will tell them that, hey, we're going to audit this action, but we're going to trust that you're going to do this because that's something that IT has decided to do. So you guys can decide how restrictive or how non-restrictive you want to be there. But the point here is you could make sure that the documents stay inside of corporate documents and are only accessible by apps that you trust. And I don't know why you wouldn't trust WordPad as an example, but that was the example I used. Another thing we can do here is if I, let's say, copy paste that corporate document into a new document, as I said, and then I save the document, what you'll see here after I've saved it, because that was corporate content, there we go, you'll see it automatically kind of inherited the protection. So the protection follows you as you traverse across apps. You have policy that dictates, which apps have access to your corporate data versus not. You have policies that allow you to say that, hey, these apps always create corporate data. So there's a ton of flexibility that's there. One other thing that's worth mentioning is well, how does Windows know what to protect? I mean, it's obvious in these scenarios because the data is already protected. But what about when I go to a file server on our network? How does it know that that's corporate versus something I got off the internet? So there's a policy that we allow you to set up. Basically a network policy that says, hey, here's my network resources, and any resources that come from these network locations should automatically be protected as they get persisted to the disk. So imagine setting up a policy that says, for instance, if you're working at Microsoft, star.corp.microsoft.com, anything that hangs under that namespace should automatically be encrypted. And so we just hook into the network stack, and as we see content ingressing from one of those locations, we'll automatically protect it. If I then traverse to the web, obviously that's a public space in most cases, then that protection wouldn't be applied. You can also apply that policy to internet connection or locations as well, so it's not just on-prem, it also works on the web. So if you had Dropbox's business storage, you could say, hey, this is a domain name that I trust, and then the data would be protected from there as well. So it's very, very flexible, and it provides, I think, the foundation and some really good out-of-the-box value for you from a DLP perspective. Let's go back to the slides here, and then let's talk about its link with RMS. So the last scenario here is, well, what happens when I want to share content? And that's where RMS is going to play an important role. EDP is going to help identify corporate documents. Everything coming in will be tagged as corporate if it's from a corporate source. We can control which apps have access to your data. We can prevent leakage, from personal or from corporate to personal, et cetera. But where we need RMS to help is when the data leaves your organization. So EDP keeps it protected while it's inside your walls. It keeps it from leaking. But if you decide to share it via email, right? I need to apply RMS protection so that it can be, so that the keys can be shared with people outside your organization if I'm sharing content B2B, B2C, et cetera, or if I'm using that data on OS X, iOS, or Android. So this is integrated, it integrates is a better word, with EDP. EDP does a lot of the heavy lifting. It kind of says, hey, here's corporate versus non-corporate data, and then RMS is going to apply that persistent protection so we can go cross-plat and share protected content when it leaves your organization. So let's move to our last area, threat resistance. And so when it comes to malware threats, the biggest challenge we face today is the PCs that we have, whether they're Windows or Linux or OS X, doesn't matter. They're all designed inherently to trust everything that comes from anywhere, right? So the device trusts everything until McAfee or Windows Defender or some other third-party solution, maybe Bit9 or AppLocker, says, don't run that executable. That's something I don't want to run. But the challenge is with 300,000 new malware threats entering, and I'm sure the number's higher. That's actually a 2013 stat. But with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of new malware instances appearing on the internet every day, the ability for any of us in the AV business to keep up and to prevent patient zeros from happening is just not possible, right? The only way we find out about new malware instance is after a bunch of people have been infected, or if the behavior of the new malware is similar to something we've seen in the past. But the attackers know that we're looking for that, so they find ways of changing the way their code works so that it defeats some of the signatures and the behavior monitoring. So what we need is a different model, and that model actually has been around on mobile devices. So if you look at Windows Phone or you look at iOS, those devices trust nothing, period, until the app the vendor is vetted, the app is vetted, it gets provisioned to your device through a secure channel, and then the app sits inside a sandbox. And so at the end of that pipeline, we end up with a result that is there's very little malware on those devices because there's just a lot of rigor in the process of getting the apps to you. On the other hand, with desktop, there's no rigor. I just proliferate malware onto the web, and it finds its way onto millions of PCs. So we need to take our PCs and change them to be a lot like Windows Phone is. We need to change them so that they trust nothing until you decide it's trustworthy. And so that's where a new feature, and this is one of the big heavy hitters here for the release, it's called Device Guard. And what Device Guard does is allows you to lock down your desktop PC to behave very, very similar to the way Windows Phone does. It trusts nothing until you say it's trustworthy, or we do. So there's a couple of paths for Device Guard. So one of those paths is for apps that get to the Device Guard PC. One of those paths is through the Windows Store. So Device Guard is designed to trust anything that comes from the Windows Store because we know that the vendor was vetted, the app was vetted, the secure pipeline, and sandbox, and whatnot. So that's a good thing there. But that doesn't represent the world of apps for the desktop. And that will be one day. The store is our strategy, and I think that will become the center of the universe for Windows desktop apps. But today, that's not the case, right? It's for a subclass. So what do we do with the apps that you're actually doing? Well, if those apps are signed, you can simply say, I trust this signature. So you can say, Windows trusts Adobe or Siebel Software, or pick your favorite ISV you're doing business with. As long as they're signing their binaries, as long as you decide to trust that signature, their app will run. So that's good. What about your apps, your line of business apps, or apps that you've acquired that were not signed? What do you do with those? Well, hopefully you can get the ISV to sign their apps. That's something they should have been doing a long time ago. But if they can't do that, or if you have internal practices where signing is not part of the app development process, we've provided you with a couple of tools. One tool is going to allow you to basically submit the app to the cloud, and the cloud will sign the app and hand it back to you. Another option are some local tools where you can sign them offline using a signature that we provide to you or one that comes from your own PKI infrastructure. So we have a bunch of options that will suit everybody's needs, all the way from the DoD types who would never submit their apps to our cloud to organizations who would be happy to do that because it makes it easier on them. So we provide this way of signing the bits in two ways. One is to directly sign the binaries, so that's physically signing the binaries. Option two is maybe a little easier for IT to deal with, which is where we indirectly sign the binaries. So what we can do is we can run this tool that will basically analyze your application. It'll basically create a hash table. It'll say, okay, here's all the files, here's all the hashes for those files, and then it will sign the catalog. And then what Device Guard will do is it'll say, hey, is the file signed? So let's say you try to run an executable. Is file signed? Yes. Okay, is it signed by something I trust? Yes, run it. If it's not signed by something I trust, let's see if we have a catalog file that is signed that has the hash for that particular image. And if the answer is yes, then we will treat it just as if it was signed directly. So device guard is going to prove very decisive in its ability to block malware, just based on its design, but it also takes advantage of the VSM technology we talked about. That decision-making on what's trustworthy versus not is not running in the main OS. It's the hypervisor code integrity service that is running in the VSM. So if you get malware, if malware was able to get on your PC and somehow was able to get a high level of privilege, which, by the way, shouldn't be able to be possible, but we have to assume that could happen, it couldn't tamper with the VSM or the code integrity's analysis of the binaries. So a lot of that decision-making execution is all happening in this isolated. And so it's very difficult to bypass this system. If the PC is equipped with what we call virtualization extensions, V-D, which is the IOMMU, it's basically IO memory management unit, what we can do is we can also offer an incredible level of vulnerability or zero-day protection. Basically, we create the condition, and it's a long conversation, where a buffer overrun just can't result in a successful exploit. Because all the memory is being managed in the VSM again, the kernel doesn't manage its own memory, and you get this case where it's very, very difficult for a zero-day to ever do anything useful. So device guard is the hammer on malware. And device guard, because it has some signing requirements, it's going to be perfect for POS systems, ATMs, and some organizations will deploy it holistically in their organization. Some organizations say, the signing requirements are a little too difficult, particularly on the lower end, the mid-market. Small businesses may find that is just a little bit too much effort. But I think that the level of malware defense that you get here is so powerful that I think it's worth the investment to do the signing. Because look how much time and effort you are cleaning up PCs with malware on them using AV types of products, right? Now, device guard is not an alternative to AV. It's something that could be used in combination. Device guard is about preventing malicious executables from running. There are other types of attacks, in-memory attacks, process injection, and whatnot. And while device guard does provide some level of protection there, AV has an opportunity to provide some added value in that particular space. So it's not a question of device guard or AV. At this time, it's a little bit of both. But AV is going to be doing a lot less work because device guard is actually going to be blocking the vast majority of the type of malware you could encounter. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Is there any thought on having stuff that's installed in Configuration Manager?
So just automatically trust it because it came by way of Config Manager?
Anything that's in Configuration Manager is hard to approve.
Yeah, I think there's some things we could do in the tooling process, maybe to make it easier. So in theory, you could say, hey, if we put it in Config Manager, then we automatically create the catalog file. So maybe there's some things we could do there. That's feedback I'd give the team. I think it's good. I think we do need to make what we have in Windows 10 is I think pretty good. It has some manual tools. I think there's things we can do futuristically to make it better, and I think that might be an idea we should look into. So let's get to the last thing. Let's see here. Didn't mean to have that demo slide there. That was a mistake. Okay, let's talk about traditional approach. So device guard's one approach. Another approach is traditional. And traditional means we're using traditional techniques. We're using mitigations in the kernel to deal with vulnerabilities. We're using AV. We're using a bunch of other solutions. So let's talk very quickly. I'll do this in like 2 minutes so we have at least a little bit of time for questions. Let's talk about what we're doing through each of these areas. When it comes to device tampering in Windows 8, the big improvement that we had were effectively two things. One was UEFI Secure Boot. That changes everything, right? That is bootkits and firmware level things like bad BIOS, they can't run, right? Secure Boot, when it's enabled, prevents anything except something that's signed by a trusted authority from getting in firmware or booting on the PC. So bootkits effectively are done with UEFI. The next thing we have is we have TPM. TPM gives us the ability to measure all of the components as they're booting, and that data can be used and sent to the cloud and compared versus known good values. So if you're familiar with Stuxnet or Flame as an example, Flame and Stuxnet would bypass Secure Boot, right? Because they were signed by legitimate signatures, right? I mean, a lot of the things we've talked about all depend on signatures remaining safe, right? TPM gives us a way of verifying, right? So we can take basically we take measurements of all the components, we can compare that in the cloud versus known good values, and in the event that somebody has a fake bootloader that's signed by Microsoft, but it's something we never ship, we can find out about that. So that's the ability to prevent tampering or detect tampering at the most sophisticated level is something we really shipped in Windows 8. When it comes into vulnerabilities, we've provided a bunch of new technology to advance our story there. So if you're familiar with ALSR and DEP in Windows 7, those technologies were really not used holistically across Windows. And so that meant that we had a lot of exposure to places in Windows where an exploit would be pretty trivial in some cases if you found the right bug in our code. So ALSR and DEP are applied holistically across Windows, and we've added some new mitigations that make it harder to manipulate things in memory. So when it comes to vulnerabilities, we're in much better shape. When it comes to malware, we're making some big changes in Windows Defender. And so Windows Defender, our goal is to make Windows Defender a leading solution in the marketplace. I don't think we've ever said that before, to be quite frank. And I think we're not in the top 5 if you look at the list from like AV Test. That's something that we want to do, and we're doing some things in Windows 10 timeframe to help us get to be top. So that's an ambition. That's something we've never stated before. One of the things we're doing in Windows Defender to enable that is we're taking advantage of the power of the cloud. So our client will actually look at the context of what's going on a PC. Let's imagine that I get a piece of email that has an attachment to it. That context will cause Windows Defender to say this is more likely to be a threat than if it came through another pathway. So we look at a lot of different variables, look at the context of what's going on in the decision, and then what we can do is we can send information up to the cloud about new images that we find on the PC and compare them versus images that other people have seen, and we can actually determine more quickly whether we have malicious, new, unknown things happening out there. So Windows Defender will be more sophisticated than ever, and then when it comes to phishing, one of the last things, or one of the big improvements we're making is related to drive-by exploits. So we have a lot of phishing attacks where it lures a user to a website that tries to maybe do a exploitive vulnerability in Java or Flash or something like that. Incidentally, IE actually has very, very few vulnerabilities. It's really Flash and Java are where I think 90+% of exploits on Windows come by way of those two plugins that run in the browser, either in IE or in others. What we do with our phishing URL reputation service now is we will not just block user from experiencing the site. We actually block this site entirely. In Windows 7 and 8, you would still go to the site. They could still exploit a vulnerability. You would get blocked from accessing the page, so they couldn't phish identity and information from you, but maybe they did a drive-by install. So we actually block the sites utterly, so you can't go to them anymore. That's something that's new in 10. So that is the fastest I could do this. So I ran into our talk time. And so anyway, Windows 10 is a dramatic improvement from a security perspective. We've really got a solution for identity, two-factor for everyone, consumers, enterprises, data protection, BitLocker automatically on a lot of PCs. You won't have to be futzing with that anymore. Malware Device Guard is the hammer on malware. This is the direction strategically it will go with all PCs. Anyway, that's it. So thank you for coming. Appreciate the time.